President Trump says a decision on how to respond to a suspected chemical attack in Syria will be made soon. After raising expectations this week of imminent action, Mr. Trump said tonight meetings are still being held.
We're looking very, very seriously, very closely at that whole situation, and we'll see what happens, folks. We'll see what happens.
Here, an emergency cabinet meeting is held to discuss British involvement in any action. We'll bring you the latest from Westminster and Washington, also tonight. An inquiry into the sexual abuse of young boys in Rochdale says the local council failed to keep children safe for 25 years. Latest figures for accident and emergency waiting times in England are the worst since records began 14 years ago. Sir Cliff Richard at the High Court. He claims the BBC breached his privacy and data protection over a police raid on his home. And Bolt's back, but not on the track. The former champion arrives in the Gold Coast to cheer on the Commonwealth Games athletes.
And coming up on BBC News, Arsenal are in relaxed mood ahead of their Europa League second leg in Moscow. But what about their fans?
Good evening. President Trump has said decisions on how to respond to the chemical attack in Syria will be made soon. His Defence Secretary Jim Mattis said no decision had yet been made to launch military attacks and that the options would be discussed at a meeting of the National Security Council today. President Macron of France said they had proof the Syrian government carried out the chemical attack and asserted that France and the US would react at a time of their choosing. Syria has said international chemical weapons experts are due to arrive in the country today and tomorrow to examine the affected site for themselves. Here's our Middle East editor, Jeremy Bowen.
In the streets of Douma, supporters of President Assad paraded. The town's been a no-go area for them for more than 6 years. Russian troops are close by, alongside their Syrian allies. Moscow denies there was a chemical attack here. In Washington, President Trump's morning tweet was less belligerent. He posted, "Never said when an attack on Syria would take place. Could be very soon, or not so soon at all." Later, President Trump didn't give much more away.
We're looking very, very seriously, very closely at that whole situation, and we'll see what happens, folks. We'll see what happens. It's too bad that the world puts us in a position like that.
Congressman,
The U.S. Defense Secretary hinted at a delay to wait for evidence from the bomb site.
there was a chemical attack, and we're looking for the actual evidence. The OPCW, this is the Organization for the Chemical Weapons Convention. We're trying to get those inspectors in probably within the week.
In Damascus, President Assad projected a calm face, greeting a top advisor to Iran's supreme leader. But Syrian forces are reported to be moving out of bases and installations that could be potential targets. In Moscow, the foreign ministry is adamant they're facing a Western provocation.
We are not seeking an escalation, but we also will not support false accusations.
On French TV, President Macron tried to reassure those who worry more war in Syria could lead to disaster.
What we're doing today, and what we'll have to do in Syria, is to stick to our priorities and to ensure the maximum stability in the region. In no case will France allow an escalation or anything else that could destabilise the region to take place.
Another possible reason for delaying an attack, the Americans only dispatched a carrier battle group from Norfolk, Virginia, 24 hours ago.
I'm so pleased and proud of the Harry S. Truman Carrier Strike Group team, 6,500 of the finest Americans you could ever sail with or serve with. We're trained, we're ready, any mission, anytime, anywhere, we're ready to go.
They're determined, but with more than 5,000 miles at sea ahead of them. The Americans, British and French between them could attack Syria without a US carrier, probably very soon. But hitting the Syrian regime without making the lives of civilians worse will be difficult, and generals, admirals and politicians might want more time to think. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News.
Well, in a moment, we'll speak to our Moscow correspondent, Steve Rosenberg. But first to our North America editor, John Sopel in Washington. And John, what are we to make of the changes of tone coming from the US?
Well, I get a sense, Rita, the sound of brakes being applied. Not screeching tyre marks, black skid marks on the road, but certainly a slowing of momentum. If you just think back, Sunday, Donald Trump says there is going to be a big price to pay for this alleged chemical weapons attack. Yesterday, he was talking about those missiles, nice, new and smart, that would be raining down. And I think that seemed to have been a turning point almost at the White House, because last night at the White House they were talking about all options being on the table, no decisions being made. You heard that again from the President today, and you heard from the Defence Secretary, as we heard there in Jeremy Bowen's report, of him saying we're looking for evidence that there was a chemical weapons attack. Now, does that mean the Americans aren't going to attack until such times as they have got evidence? That all points to this slowing down. Now, if you're being kind, you'd say maybe this is the fog of war. Keep the enemy guessing. The other interpretation, though, is that there is still a degree of indecision and a degree of confusion over what to do next.
And Steve Rosenberg in Moscow, what's the mood where you are?
Well, you know, if Donald Trump's aim via Twitter is to spread chaos and confusion about his intentions, it's certainly working here in Moscow, because the Russians are mightily confused. I was watching a live political talk show earlier today on Russian state television when the news came in that President Trump had tweeted that an attack on Syria could happen very soon or not soon at all. And the presenter looked to the camera, seemed very confused, and basically said one word, "Kruto," which means incredible. She smiled in disbelief. And the Russians don't know what to believe. Will there be an attack? Won't there be an attack? One other interesting thing happened today. The Kremlin said that a special crisis communications link that had been set up before by the Russian and US militaries to ensure there could be no accidental clash in Syria, the Kremlin said that line was still operational, it was still being used. And that suggests that perhaps conversations are taking place behind the scenes to ensure that if there is a US strike on Syria, that doesn't spark an accidental conflict between Russia and the United States.
Steve, thank you. Steve Rosenberg there in Moscow, and thank you too to John Sopel in Washington. Well, here Theresa May and her ministers have gathered at a special cabinet meeting to discuss Britain's response to events in Syria. There have been calls from opposition parties and some Conservatives for MPs to get a vote before the UK joins any military action. From Westminster, here's our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar.
Secretary of State, is the military ready? Things to do, bombing raids to support. The Defence Secretary, the whole Cabinet called in today to discuss and approve Britain's part in any airstrikes in Syria. Is bombing the answer?
I'm just going to go straight in.
Ministers met to see the intelligence showing the Assad regime was behind the chemical attack that killed dozens. A lone protester tried to get in the way and failed. Inside the Cabinet, one who'd opposed airstrikes 5 years ago had changed his mind. Why?
For two reasons. One was because we hadn't provided the evidence and intelligence that we knew who it was. And secondly, because there was not a proper plan which was thought through properly. Those two things, I'm sure, we're going to answer today.
No sight or word from the Prime Minister yet, so a former Tory leader passed on the message. Action was justified. Swift action.
These are a real and genuine threat to everybody. They cannot be used. They've been used in Salisbury against British citizens. We need to put our foot down now, and we need to strike their ability to use them, stockpile them, manufacture them, or deliver them. And I think that is the key element of what action should be taken.
So no obvious problem with cabinet approval. Mrs May supports urgent action to prevent another chemical attack. And remember, the military need clear justification for offensive operations. But Parliament is having to wait, maybe till after the bombing. The Labour leader believes he speaks for people who want peace and a bigger role for Parliament.
More bombing, more killing, more war will not save life. We elect members of Parliament. They should have a voice in this. The Cabinet on its own should not be making this decision.
In the last few moments, the Cabinet meeting has ended. Meanwhile, MPs on all sides are weighing up their position for and against airstrikes. Many want to say before it happens.
You always need parliamentary approval if you're planning the use of significant military force for policy reasons. We're a modern parliamentary democracy.
We know about the consequences of intervening. Syria stands as a test case about the consequences of not intervening.
The position is a very dangerous one because of Russian involvement, also because we have a very erratic President of the United States. I don't rule out the fact that I and the Liberal Democrats might support the government if a case is made, but it's got to be made.
The last Tory Prime Minister lost a vote on Syria in 2013. Will Parliament back Mrs May? Well, if military action goes according to plan, some Tories may swallow any doubts, and MPs on both sides may hesitate before denying British forces political cover. But Mrs May will be accused by critics of bypassing Parliament and dancing to Donald Trump's tune. With national influence at stake, the Prime Minister was keen to back up her American ally. Britain is heading for conflict, abroad and at home. The only question now is when.